Then my father-in-law's voice cut through it like a blade. "That's not just my daughter-in-law. That's General Martinez, the youngest female general in U.S. military history." Every face in the room went white. They'd spent 3 years treating me like hired help, never knowing I outranked every man in their social circle. Walking into the Blackwood estate felt like entering enemy territory. The mansion sprawled across 10 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in the most exclusive part of Greenwich, Connecticut. Every detail screamed generational wealth, from the imported Italian marble floors that gleamed under Austrian crystal chandeliers to the oil paintings of dead Blackwood ancestors staring down from mahogany-paneled walls like judges presiding over a court of privilege. I paused in the grand foyer, adjusting my dress uniform one last time. The navy blue fabric was pressed to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. The weight of my ribbons and medals felt familiar against my chest: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon, and 23 others that represented years of service, sacrifice, and blood spilled on foreign soil. Each one told a story these people would never understand or appreciate. 3 years. 3 years of being married to David Blackwood, heir to one of New England's oldest legal dynasties. And his family still treated me like I was some charity case he'd rescued from a bus station. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd grown up in a single-wide trailer in rural Alabama, the daughter of a mechanic and a diner waitress. To them, I might as well have crawled out of the primordial ooze. Tonight was supposed to be different. David had just made senior partner at Blackwood & Associates, the family law firm that had been manipulating the legal system for 5 generations. I thought maybe, finally, with his career secured and our marriage hitting the 3-year mark, they'd stop seeing me as a temporary inconvenience and start treating me like family. I was catastrophically wrong. The living room buzzed with conversation as Connecticut's elite mingled over champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. I recognized faces from newspaper society pages, judges, senators, Fortune 500 CEOs, and old money aristocrats whose families had been influential since before the Civil War. The men wore hand-tailored tuxedos. The women draped themselves in designer gowns and jewelry worth more than military salaries. I conducted what my training called a battlefield assessment, scanning for allies, threats, and escape routes. What I found wasn't encouraging. David stood near the fireplace, surrounded by his law school buddies and firm colleagues. At 6'2", with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident smile that opens doors, he looked every inch the golden boy his family had groomed him to be. He was deep in conversation about some corporate merger, gesturing with his crystal tumbler of 18-year-old scotch. When our eyes met across the room, he gave me a distracted wave before immediately turning back to his conversation. That wave said everything. "You're here, I see you, now let me get back to important things." Margaret Blackwood materialized beside me like a designer-clad specter. At 62, she maintained the kind of artificial perfection that only unlimited money could buy: surgically tightened face, professionally maintained platinum blonde hair, and a wardrobe that probably cost more than I'd made in my first 2 years of service. Her smile was as genuine as a politician's campaign promise. "Oh, Sophia," she said, her voice carrying the particular brand of false warmth that rich women had perfected over centuries. "How military of you to wear your uniform to a civilian celebration." The emphasis on military made it sound like a social disease. Her eyes swept over my ribbons with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something unpleasant stuck to her designer shoe. "I thought it was appropriate," I replied evenly, years of military discipline keeping my voice neutral. "David's achievement deserves to be honored with the same respect I'd show any important occasion." Margaret's laugh tinkled like breaking crystal. How delightfully earnest. Though I suppose when one doesn't have extensive formal wear, one makes do with what's available. The insult was wrapped in silk but landed like a brick. I'd worn my dress uniform because it was the finest thing I owned, yes, but also because it represented everything I'd achieved through blood, sweat, and determination. To her, it was evidence of my inadequacy. Behind Margaret, a small crowd of Blackwood family members and their social circle had begun to gather, drawn by the scent of fresh drama like sharks to blood in the water. Caroline Blackwood Ashworth, David's older sister, whispered something to her husband Preston, while both stared at me with undisguised amusement. Caroline had inherited her mother's platinum hair and sharp tongue, but added her own special brand of entitled cruelty. At 32, she'd never worked a day in her life, moving seamlessly from private school to Yale to marriage to a trust fund brat, whose greatest accomplishment was inheriting a textile fortune. Such a need to show off. Caroline's whisper carried just far enough for me to hear, which was obviously intentional. I mean, we get it. You were in the army or whatever. Navy, I corrected quietly, though I knew the distinction meant nothing to her. Preston Ashworth III snickered into his champagne. Same difference, really. Point and shoot, right? I felt my jaw clench. 4 deployments, 3 combat zones, and countless life-or-death decisions reduced to, quote, point and shoot, by a man whose biggest challenge was choosing which country club to join. David's uncle Richard joined the growing circle, his face already flushed from too much expensive alcohol. Richard Blackwood was a Massachusetts state senator who'd rode his family name to political office without ever having an original thought or fighting for anything more challenging than a parking space. You know, Sophia, Richard said, swaying slightly, I've always wondered, don't you feel a bit out of place? I mean, this isn't exactly boot camp. He gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings, his meaning clear. Different environments require different skills, Senator, I replied, using his title with just enough emphasis to remind him that at least his position required some form of public service, however minimal. Margaret stepped closer, her perfume, something French and expensive that probably cost more than a month of military combat pay, nearly overwhelming. Of course, we appreciate your service. It's just that David's life requires certain social graces, connections, the ability to navigate complex situations with finesse. The implication hung in the air like smoke. You're too crude, too simple, too working class for our refined world. I've navigated complex situations before, I said, thinking of firefights in Afghanistan, hostage negotiations in Somalia, and coordinating humanitarian missions in disaster zones, usually with higher stakes than choosing the right wine for dinner. Caroline laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. Oh, how dramatic. Though I suppose when one's only exposure to culture comes from military bases. Quote, Caroline, a new voice interrupted, calm but carrying unmistakable authority. Colonel James Blackwood, retired, approached our group with measured steps, his bearing still ramrod straight despite his 68 years. Unlike his wife and daughter, who wore their wealth like armor, James had a quiet dignity that spoke of genuine accomplishment rather than inherited privilege. His silver hair was military short, his gray eyes sharp and assessing, and when he moved, it was with the controlled precision of someone who'd once led men into combat. Perhaps, he continued, his voice cutting through the social chatter, we should focus on celebrating David's achievement, rather than dissecting anyone's wardrobe choices. Margaret's smile became strained. Of course, darling, we were just making conversation. James's eyes met mine briefly, a look I couldn't quite read, before he nodded politely and moved toward the bar. In 3 years of marriage to David, I could count on one hand the number of times my father-in-law had spoken directly to me. He was always polite, always respectful, but distant. I'd assumed it was his way of showing disapproval without openly challenging his son's choice of wife. As the evening progressed, the attacks became more sophisticated and coordinated, like a military operation designed to break down enemy morale through psychological warfare. When someone asked about my career plans, Margaret was quick to jump in. Oh, Sophia's taking some time to adjust to civilian life, she said with false sympathy. It can be quite difficult, transitioning from such a structured environment to the complexities of real-world responsibilities. The implication was clear. I was unemployed and unemployable, a kept woman living off David's success. Actually, I said, maintaining my composure, I'm considering several opportunities in logistics and strategic planning. My experience in operational command has given me skills that translate well to civilian leadership roles. Preston snorted. Command? How many people did you boss around? 12? 20? Before I could answer, Caroline chimed in with fake concern. It must be so hard. Going from giving orders to, Well, whatever it is, military wives do all day. The casual dismissal of my service record, my capabilities, and my identity hit like a physical blow, but I'd been trained to endure worse than social warfare. I stood straighter, squared my shoulders, and reminded myself that I'd faced down enemy combatants and international crises. I could handle a bunch of privileged Connecticut socialites. The worst moment came when David finally joined our group, his face flushed with alcohol and success. Someone asked him how we'd met, and I waited for him to tell the real story. How he'd been doing pro bono work for veterans. How I'd impressed him with my intelligence and determination. How he'd pursued me despite knowing his family would disapprove. Instead, he laughed and said, "Oh, you know how it is. I was going through my helping the less fortunate phase, and Sophia was so grateful for the attention." The words hit me like shrapnel. In one sentence, he'd reduced our entire relationship to charity work and painted me as a desperate woman grateful for any crumb of attention from her social superior. The group laughed appreciatively at his honesty, while I felt something inside me crystallize into cold, hard resolve. I'd survived combat zones, earned the respect of some of the finest officers in the military, and led operations that saved countless lives. I didn't deserve this, and I sure as hell wasn't going to stand here and take it. Throughout the evening, I noticed Colonel James watching these interactions with increasing tension around his eyes. When Margaret made particularly cutting remarks, his jaw would tighten almost imperceptibly. When Caroline delivered her poisoned barbs, his fingers would drum once against his glass. And when David delivered his casual betrayal, I saw something flash across the older man's face that looked almost like anger. But he said nothing. Just watched, assessed, and waited. I was beginning to understand that there was much more to my father-in-law than his family realized. His silence wasn't approval of their behavior. It was the careful observation of a strategic mind-gathering intelligence. What I didn't know yet was that Colonel James Blackwood knew exactly who I was, what I'd accomplished, and why his family's treatment of me was about to become the biggest mistake of their privileged lives. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I excused myself to the bathroom to regroup and plan my exit strategy. Looking in the mirror, I saw a woman in uniform who'd been pushed to her breaking point by people who had no idea what real strength looked like. But I also saw something else, a soldier who'd never backed down from a fight, especially when the cause was just. They wanted to treat me like I didn't belong? Fine. They were about to learn exactly who they'd been underestimating. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October sunshine that made Connecticut look like a postcard. All golden leaves and pristine lawns that cost more to maintain than most people's annual salaries. I sat in the sunroom of our Westport home, David's home, really, purchased with family money, sipping coffee that tasted like ash and staring at my phone. 3 missed calls from my former commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Rodriguez, 2 text messages from my old unit asking when I was coming back to visit, and 1 email that made my stomach clench, an invitation to speak at the Women in Military Leadership Conference next month. The same conference where last year I'd been scheduled as the keynote speaker before David convinced me to decline, saying it would, quote, complicate his family dynamics. I'd built my entire identity around service, leadership, and protecting others. Now I spent my days in a house that felt like a museum, married to a man who introduced me as a charity case, surrounded by people who saw my greatest achievements as social embarrassments. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd survived enemy fire, but I was slowly dying in a Connecticut suburb. David emerged from his home office around 10, already dressed in his $1,000 suit and checking his Rolex, a graduation gift from his parents that cost more than most soldiers made in 6 months. He looked surprised to see me still in my robe. "You're not dressed yet?" he asked, grabbing his travel mug. "The charity luncheon starts at noon." "Right. The Hartford Women's Club Charity Luncheon. Another opportunity for Connecticut's elite to congratulate themselves on their generosity while writing tax-deductible checks and gossiping about people they considered beneath them." "I'm not going," I said quietly. David paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. "What do you mean you're not going? I already told Mother you'd be there." "Then you can tell her I changed my mind." His face shifted into what I'd come to recognize as his managing difficult people expression, the same one he used with particularly stubborn clients. Sophia, we've talked about this. These events are important for my career. People expect to see us together. People expect to see you with an appropriate wife, I corrected. Someone who knows which fork to use and doesn't embarrass you by existing. David set down his mug with more force than necessary. That's not fair. You know I don't think that way. Don't you? I stood, tightening my robe around me. Because last night you told a room full of people that our relationship started as your charity work. You reduced 3 years of marriage to you helping the less fortunate. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I was drunk. It came out wrong. No, David. It came out honest. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or recognition of the truth. But it was quickly replaced by irritation. Look, I know my family can be challenging, but they'll come around. These things take time. 3 years isn't enough time? They're set in their ways. Old-fashioned. But they mean well. I almost laughed. Margaret Blackwood, who'd spent the previous evening systematically attempting to destroy my self-worth, meant well. Caroline, who'd compared my intelligence to that of a trained dog, meant well. The entire social ecosystem that viewed my military service as evidence of my unsuitability for polite society meant well. I'm done pretending, I said. I'm done being ashamed of who I am to make your family comfortable. David's expression hardened. No one's asking you to be ashamed, we're asking you to be realistic. This is how things work in our world. There are expectations, standards. Standards I don't meet. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. The silence stretched between us like a minefield. 3 years of accumulated resentments, compromises, and small betrayals hung in the air. David checked his watch again, the universal signal that this conversation was taking too long and interfering with more important matters. The luncheon is important to Mother, he said finally. She's chairing the committee this year. Then she'll have to chair it without me. David grabbed his briefcase and keys with sharp, angry movements. Fine. But don't expect me to keep making excuses for your behavior. After he left, I sat in the silence of the house and tried to remember who I'd been before I'd started apologizing for my existence. The woman who'd led troops through hostile territory, who'd made life-or-death decisions under fire, who'd earned the respect of some of the finest military minds in the country. That woman wouldn't have spent 3 years slowly disappearing to make other people comfortable. I was still in my robe when the doorbell rang at 11:30. Through the security camera, I could see a black sedan in the driveway and a man in a dark suit standing at the door. My training kicked in automatically. Assess, identify, respond. Government plates on the sedan. Professional bearing. Official business. I threw on jeans and a sweater before answering the door. The man was probably mid-40s, with the kind of haircut and posture that screamed federal law enforcement. Mrs. Blackwood, Agent Marcus Sullivan, Defense Intelligence Agency. He showed me his credentials. I wonder if we could have a conversation. My blood turned to ice water. DIA doesn't make social calls. Is everything all right? Has something happened to? No active threats, he assured me quickly. But there are some matters we'd like to discuss. May I come in? I led him to the living room, my mind racing through possibilities. Security clearance issues? Problems with someone from my old unit? My father-in-law's military background? Agent Sullivan declined coffee and got straight to business. Mrs. Blackwood, we're conducting a routine security review of personnel who've had access to classified operations. Your name came up in connection with Operation Nightingale. Operation Nightingale. I hadn't heard that name in 2 years, and it still made my chest tighten. A joint military intelligence operation in Syria that had saved 43 civilian hostages and eliminated a major terrorist cell. Also classified at levels that required congressional notification. I signed all the appropriate non-disclosure agreements, I said carefully. Yes, you did. And your record shows exemplary discretion. That's actually why we're here. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. We have a situation developing in Eastern Europe. Similar parameters to Nightingale. We need someone with your specific skill set and clearance level. I stared at him. I'm retired from active duty. Consulting basis. Civilian contractor. 6-month assignment, potentially renewable. Full presidential authority. The tablet showed mission parameters, threat assessments, and team compositions. It was the kind of work I'd dreamed of. Complex, important, challenging. The kind of mission that could save lives and make a real difference in the world. The pay scale is substantial, Agent Sullivan continued. And given your unique background in both military operations and civilian integration, you'd be an ideal cultural liaison. I almost laughed at the irony. My civilian integration consisted of 3 years of social humiliation and slowly losing myself in a world that didn't want me. But the mission itself... I need to discuss this with my husband, I said finally. Of course. But, Mrs. Blackwood, he paused, choosing his words carefully. This opportunity won't wait indefinitely. People with your clearance level and operational experience are rare. We need a decision within the week. After he left, I sat staring at the mission briefing he'd left behind. 6 months working with an international team on a classified operation that mattered. 6 months using skills I'd spent years developing. 6 months being valued for my expertise instead of apologized for. 6 months away from Connecticut, from the charity luncheons and society dinners where I was treated like David's embarrassing secret. My phone rang. David's name on the caller ID. Sophia, I'm sorry about this morning, he said without preamble. I know this hasn't been easy for you. Maybe we can talk about taking a vacation, somewhere tropical, just the two of us. David, I need to tell you something. Can it wait? I'm about to go into a client meeting, but I wanted to call and... The Defense Intelligence Agency just offered me a consulting position. Silence. Then, what kind of consulting position? Classified. 6 months in Eastern Europe. It's important work. Sophia, you can't be serious. We're building a life here. I just made senior partner. Mother is finally starting to plan events that include you. Events where I'm treated like the help? That's not... Look, can we discuss this tonight? I really do have to go. The line went dead. I looked down at the mission briefing again. At the opportunity to be useful, valued, respected. To remember who I was before I'd started shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. At 3 o'clock, Margaret called. Sophia, dear, I was so disappointed you couldn't join us for the luncheon today. We raised over $50,000 for literacy programs. That's wonderful, I said, not bothering to hide my lack of enthusiasm. I do hope you're feeling better. David mentioned you weren't well. Of course he had. Rather than admit his wife had refused to attend another social humiliation session, he'd invented an illness. Another small lie in the architecture of our marriage. Actually, Margaret, I'm feeling clearer than I have in years. Oh, that's lovely. You know, I was thinking we should have lunch this week. Just the two of us. There are some things I'd like to discuss. The tone suggested this wasn't a social invitation. This was a summit meeting, probably to address my, quote, "tude problem and remind me of my proper place in the Blackwood ecosystem." I might not be available, I said. I'm considering a work opportunity. Work? The word sounded foreign in her mouth, like I'd suggested taking up professional sword swallowing. What kind of work? Government consulting. It would require travel. Oh, Sophia. Her voice took on that particular tone of false sympathy that meant a lecture was coming. I understand the need to feel useful, but surely you can find something more appropriate. Volunteer work, perhaps. The Garden Club is always looking for help with their events. The Garden Club, where I could arrange flowers and serve tea to women who measured their worth by their husbands' bank accounts and their children's prep school acceptances. This is a bit more complex than flower arranging, I said. I'm sure it is, dear, but you have to think about how this reflects on David, on the family. What will people think if you're gallivanting around Europe on some government adventure? People might think David had married a competent, accomplished woman instead of a decorative accessory. The horror. I have to go, Margaret. Sophia, wait. Perhaps we should have that lunch tomorrow. I think there are some misunderstandings we need to clear up. I don't think lunch will solve this. Sophia. Margaret's voice lost its fake warmth, revealing the steel underneath. David is at a crucial point in his career. The family has invested considerable time and resources in his success. I won't allow that to be jeopardized by impulsive decisions. There it was, the threat wrapped in maternal concern. Fall in line or face the consequences. Is that what you told his first girlfriend? I asked. The one Caroline mentioned at Christmas? What was her name? Rebecca, the one who was obviously wrong for the family. Silence. Then, very quietly, Rebecca understood her limitations. And what are my limitations, Margaret? I think you know. The line went dead. I sat holding the phone, feeling something crystallize inside me. For 3 years, I'd tried to be good enough, appropriate enough, small enough to fit into their world. I'd diminished myself, hidden my achievements, apologized for my existence. And it would never be enough. Because the problem wasn't my behavior or my background or my lack of proper social graces. The problem was that I represented everything they feared. Competence earned through merit instead of inherited through bloodline. Strength built through adversity instead of protected through privilege. Value measured by contribution instead of pedigree. I was living proof that their system wasn't the only way, and that made me dangerous. At 6 o'clock, I called Agent Sullivan. Mrs. Blackwood, have you made a decision? I'm interested, but I have questions about the operational parameters. Of course. Can you meet tomorrow morning? We have a secure facility in Hartford where we can discuss details. I'll be there. Excellent. And Mrs. Blackwood? This conversation stays between us until the final briefing. After I hung up, I looked around the living room with its designer furniture and fresh flowers that a service delivered twice a week. Everything perfect, everything appropriate, everything empty. I thought about the hostages we'd rescued in Operation Nightingale. 43 people who went home to their families because a team of professionals had done their jobs with skill and courage. Work that mattered. Purpose that went beyond social climbing and charity luncheons. David came home at 8, carrying takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant, his version of an apology. How was your client meeting? I asked, as we unpacked containers of pad thai and green curry. Good, productive. Listen, about this morning, I know I handled it badly. Which part, the charity case comment or dismissing my feelings? He winced. Both. I'm sorry. I know my family can be overwhelming. But they really are trying. Are they? Because your mother called today to discuss my limitations. David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. What did she say? She reminded me that your career is more important than my dignity. She didn't say that. She didn't have to. We ate in silence for a while, the weight of 3 years of accumulated resentment settling between us like a third person at the table. Tell me about this job offer, David said finally. Classified government consulting, Eastern Europe, 6 months. What kind of consulting? The kind that matters. David set down his fork and looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in months. You're serious about this? Dead serious. Quote, Sophia, I can't just put my life on hold for 6 months while you go off and play soldier again. I'm not asking you to put your life on hold. I'm asking you to support your wife's career. Your career ended when you left the military. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Everything we'd been dancing around for 3 years finally spoken aloud. So what am I supposed to do? I asked quietly. Arrange flowers for the garden club? Serve tea at charity events? Smile and nod while your family explains all the ways I'm inadequate? You're supposed to be my partner. Help me build something here. Build what? A life where I disappear a little more each day? David pushed back from the table, frustration written across his face. This is about last night, isn't it? You're upset about what I said, so you're threatening to run away. I'm not running away. I'm remembering who I am. Who you were, he corrected. That's not who you are anymore. I stood slowly, understanding with perfect clarity that this wasn't just about a job offer. This was about whether I was going to continue slowly suffocating in a life that didn't fit, or fight to reclaim the person I'd been before I'd started apologizing for my existence. You're right, I said. I'm not who I was. I'm less, I'm smaller, I'm quieter. I've spent 3 years becoming the person you and your family needed me to be. And I hate her. Sophia. I hate the woman who apologizes for wearing her military uniform to formal events. I hate the woman who pretends not to understand tactical discussions so she doesn't make other people uncomfortable. I hate the woman who nods and smiles while being insulted by people whose greatest challenge is choosing between the club or the yacht. David's face had gone pale. That's not what I wanted. Isn't it? You married a decorated military officer and tried to turn her into a Connecticut housewife. You took someone who'd led troops in combat and asked her to arrange flowers. I fell in love with you, he said quietly. No. You fell in love with the idea of rescuing me. You're helping the less fortunate phase, remember? The silence stretched between us, filled with the ghosts of conversations we'd never had and compromises that had cost too much. If you take this job, David said finally, don't expect me to be here when you get back. I looked at him, this man I'd married, this stranger who'd slowly convinced me to become a stranger to myself. I wouldn't expect you to be. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about roads not taken. About the woman I'd been in uniform, confident and capable and proud. About the missions that had given my life purpose and meaning. About the respect I'd earned through blood and sweat and competence. About the woman I could be again if I had the courage to remember her. In the morning, I would drive to Hartford and accept Agent Sullivan's offer. I would begin the process of reclaiming the life I'd abandoned for the promise of acceptance that never came. But tonight I mourned the 3 years I'd lost trying to become someone else's version of who I should be. Tomorrow I would start becoming myself again. Part 3. The Revelation. The Hartford DIA facility looked like any other office building from the outside. Glass and steel, corporate bland, designed to blend into the landscape of Connecticut's insurance capital. But the security checkpoints, biometric scanners, and the way every person I passed carried themselves with military precision told a different story. Agent Sullivan met me in the lobby at 9 sharp, his expression serious but not unfriendly. Mrs. Blackwood, thank you for coming. Are you ready for this? I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what this entailed. The drive from Westport had given me 2 hours to think, and I'd spent most of it remembering who I used to be, the woman who'd briefed generals, who'd made decisions that affected international operations, who'd never once apologized for taking up space in a room. Before we begin, Sullivan said as we walked through corridors lined with photographs of military operations and intelligence achievements, I should mention that we've had an unusual request regarding your briefing. What kind of request? Someone has asked to sit in on the session, someone with the appropriate clearance and a personal interest in your potential involvement. My stomach clenched. David? Had he somehow used his family connections to interfere? Who? Sullivan stopped outside a conference room with frosted glass doors. See for yourself. He opened the door, and I stepped into a room with a long mahogany table, wall-mounted monitors, and 3 people waiting for me. I recognized the first 2 immediately, Colonel Martinez, who'd been my commanding officer during Operation Nightingale, and General Patricia Hayes, one of the highest-ranking women in the U.S. military. The third person made me freeze in the doorway. Colonel James Blackwood sat at the far end of the table, no longer the silent, mysterious father-in-law who watched family gatherings with unreadable eyes. This was a different man entirely, ramrod straight, wearing dress blues with ribbons that told the story of a distinguished military career, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Hello, Sophia," he said quietly. "I think it's time we had a proper conversation." I looked between him and the others, my mind racing. "Sir, I don't understand." "What are you doing here?" General Hayes stood, extending her hand. "General Sophia Martinez, it's an honor to finally meet you properly." Quote. I shook her hand automatically, still staring at my father-in-law. "General?" Colonel Martinez smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen in months. "Sophia, when Agent Sullivan told us you were considering the consulting position, we thought it was time you learned a few things about your family connections." "Family connections?" James Blackwood, Colonel Blackwood, gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Sophia, please." I sat, feeling like I'd walked into an alternate reality. Agent Sullivan took a seat to my left, opening a thick file folder. "What you're about to hear," General Hayes said, "is classified at the highest levels. But given your clearance and the nature of this operation, you need to understand the full picture." Colonel Blackwood leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. Sophia, 3 years ago, when David brought you home to meet the family, I knew exactly who you were. Not just your name or your service record. I knew your operational history, your clearance level, and your role in some of the most sensitive missions our military has conducted in the past decade. My mouth felt dry. How? Because I was your oversight officer for Operation Nightingale. The room seemed to tilt. Operation Nightingale had been a joint task force, with oversight from the Pentagon's highest levels. I'd known there were senior officers involved, but the operational security had been so tight that most of us never knew who was watching from above. You were in Syria, I said slowly. I was in a bunker in Virginia, watching satellite feeds and coordinating with the State Department while you and your team risked your lives to save those hostages. His voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Do you remember the moment when the mission parameters changed? When you had to adapt the extraction plan on the fly because the intelligence was wrong? I remembered. We'd been 30 minutes into what should have been a straightforward rescue when we discovered the terrorists had moved the hostages to a different building. The original plan was worthless, and we had minutes to improvise or watch 43 innocent people die. You made a decision that night, Colonel Blackwood continued, that saved every life in that compound. You also prevented an international incident that could have destabilized the entire region. The President of the United States personally reviewed your actions and classified them as exemplary under extreme circumstances. Colonel Martinez nodded. What he's not telling you is that your innovative tactical approach became required study at West Point. You're taught in leadership courses now. I stared at them, feeling disconnected from my own body. I don't understand. If you knew all this, why didn't you ever say anything? Why did you let your family treat me like... Like what? Colonel Blackwood's voice was quiet but intense. Like I was nobody. Like I was David's charity project. The silence in the room was deafening. General Hayes and Colonel Martinez exchanged glances, while Agent Sullivan studied his files with obvious discomfort. Sophia, Colonel Blackwood said finally, I've spent 3 years watching my family humiliate one of the finest officers I've ever had the privilege to oversee. Do you think that was easy for me? Then why didn't you stop it? Because I was under orders. More silence. Then Agent Sullivan cleared his throat. Mrs. Blackwood, your marriage to David wasn't entirely coincidental. My blood turned to ice. What do you mean? General Hayes leaned forward. 3 years ago, we identified a potential security risk in the Hartford area. Someone with access to high-level legal and political networks was suspected of selling information to foreign interests. We needed someone on the inside, someone with the right clearance, the right background, and the right motivation to monitor the situation. You're saying I was a plant? Not exactly, Colonel Martinez said quickly. Your relationship with David developed naturally, but when our surveillance identified him as a person of interest, and we learned you were involved with him, certain decisions were made. I felt sick. What kind of decisions? Colonel Blackwood's jaw was tight. I was ordered to maintain operational distance from you, to observe without interfering, to let my family treat you however they wanted, because your response to that treatment would tell us everything we needed to know about your character and your loyalty. You used me as bait. We used you as an asset, General Hayes corrected, and you performed flawlessly, even though you didn't know you were performing. Agent Sullivan opened his file. For 3 years, you've been in the perfect position to observe David's professional activities, his family's business dealings, and their social connections. Every dinner party, every charity event, every family gathering, you've been our eyes and ears in a world we couldn't otherwise access. But I never reported anything. I didn't even know I was supposed to be watching. You didn't need to report, Colonel Blackwood said. We've been monitoring everything. Your phone, your email, your conversations. Everything you've seen and heard has been recorded and analyzed. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. You've been spying on me for 3 years? We've been protecting national security, General Hayes said calmly. And you've been instrumental in that protection, whether you knew it or not. What did you find? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Agent Sullivan turned his tablet toward me. The screen showed financial records, email chains, and surveillance photos. David's law firm has been facilitating money laundering for a network of Eastern European criminals. They've also been providing legal cover for technology transfers that violate arms export regulations. My legs felt weak. I sat back down, staring at the evidence. David? Not directly involved in the operations, Colonel Martinez said. But he's been willfully blind to what his firm was doing. His uncle Richard has been the main facilitator, using his political connections to smooth the way. And Margaret? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. She's been the social coordinator, Agent Sullivan said, using charity events and dinner parties to bring together buyers and sellers, creating legitimate-looking social connections to cover illegal business relationships. I thought about all those gatherings I'd attended, all the conversations I'd overheard, all the times I'd felt like an outsider looking in on something I didn't understand. I hadn't been an outsider. I'd been a witness. The entire family? I whispered. Not the entire family, Colonel Blackwood said, his voice heavy with something that might have been pain. Caroline doesn't know. She's genuinely just a spoiled socialite. And David's complicated. He knows something's not right, but he's chosen not to ask questions. But you know. I've suspected for years. But I needed proof, and I needed someone on the inside who could provide it. He met my eyes. Someone I could trust completely. So you watched them destroy me for 3 years to get your proof? I watched them reveal themselves for 3 years. There's a difference. I stood again, pacing to the window that looked out over Hartford's skyline. This is insane. My entire marriage, my entire life, for the past 3 years, it's all been a lie. Your marriage was real, Colonel Blackwood said quietly. David's feelings for you are real, but the context, yes, that was orchestrated. And now? General Hayes stood as well. Now we need you to help us finish this. The Eastern European assignment Agent Sullivan mentioned? It's connected to this investigation. We've identified the foreign networks that David's firm has been working with, and we need someone with your skills to help us shut them down. Someone with my access to the Blackwood family, I corrected. That too. I turned back to face them. And if I say no? Then you say no, Colonel Martinez said. You've already given us everything we need to move forward with arrests. Your 3 years of unconscious surveillance have provided enough evidence to destroy the entire network. But, Agent Sullivan added, we'd prefer to have you involved in the endgame. You've earned the right to see this through. I looked at Colonel Blackwood. What about David? What about him? Will he be arrested? That depends on what we find in the next few weeks, and on what you decide to do. The weight of the decision settled on my shoulders like a familiar pack. I'd been carrying it without knowing it for 3 years, and now it was time to decide what to do with it. There's something else you need to know, Colonel Blackwood said, about last night. I looked at him sharply. What about last night? David called me after you told him about the job offer. He asked me to intervene, to use whatever influence I had to make the offer go away. My stomach clenched. What did you tell him? I told him that his wife was one of the most decorated officers of her generation, and that any organization would be lucky to have her services. His voice was quiet but firm. I also told him that if he couldn't see your worth, he was a fool. What did he say? He said I didn't understand the situation, that you were having trouble adjusting to civilian life and making impulsive decisions. Colonel Blackwood's jaw tightened. I told him that the only impulsive decision I could see was his failure to support his wife's career. He's going to be angry. He's going to be devastated, but not for the reasons you think. Agent Sullivan closed his file. Mrs. Blackwood, we need a decision. The operation launches next week. I looked around the room at these people who'd been watching my life from the shadows, who'd known things about my marriage that I was only learning now, who'd let me suffer through 3 years of humiliation for the greater good. If I do this, I said, I want some conditions. Name them, General Hayes said. First, I want complete operational control over my part of the mission. No more secret oversight, no more hidden agendas. Agreed. Second, I want to be the one to tell David the truth, all of it. Colonel Blackwood nodded slowly. That's your right. And third, I want a guarantee that Caroline will be protected. Whatever her mother and uncle have done, she's innocent. Already arranged, Agent Sullivan said. I took a deep breath. thinking about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, and the woman I'd become in the shadow of the Blackwood family's expectations. Thinking about the choice between safety and purpose, between acceptance and self-respect. I'll do it. The drive back to Westport gave me time to process what I'd learned and plan what I was going to say to David. The house looked different when I pulled into the driveway, less like a home and more like a crime scene waiting to be discovered. David's car wasn't there. According to the text he'd sent while I was in the briefing, he was working late, preparing for a major client presentation. The irony of that wasn't lost on me. I spent the afternoon packing, not just for the mission but for whatever came after. 3 years of my life folded into suitcases and boxes, reduced to the essentials of someone who was leaving and might not be coming back. At 6 o'clock, I heard David's key in the lock. "Sophia?" he called. "Are you home?" "In here," I called back from the living room. He appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie, looking tired but pleased with himself. "How was your day? Did you think more about what we discussed?" "I did." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit down, David. We need to talk." Something in my tone made his expression shift from casual confidence to wariness. He sat slowly, studying my face. "I went to Hartford today," I said. "I met with Agent Sullivan and some other people." "About the job?" "About a lot of things." I took a breath. "David, how much do you know about your family's business dealings?" His face went carefully blank. "What kind of question is that?" "The kind that determines whether you get arrested along with your mother and uncle." The color drained from his face. "Sophia, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about money laundering, arms dealing, and using charity events to cover criminal activity. I'm talking about your law firm facilitating illegal technology transfers. I'm talking about 3 years of federal surveillance that's about to become 3 years of federal prosecutions." David stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "That's impossible. You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" "Tell me, David. Have you ever wondered why your Uncle Richard takes so many trips to Eastern Europe? Why your mother insists on inviting so many foreign businessmen to her charity events? Why your firm handles so many international clients with questionable backgrounds? You're being paranoid. Am I? Or have you been willfully ignorant because it was easier than asking questions?" David spun to face me. "Even if something was going on, which I'm not saying it is, what does that have to do with you?" "Everything." I stood as well. "David, I've been under federal surveillance for 3 years. Every conversation we've had, every dinner party we've attended, every family gathering, it's all been recorded and analyzed. That's illegal. Not when you're married to someone with the highest level security clearance who's been unconsciously serving as an intelligence asset." David stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm not who you think I am. I'm not the helpless military wife who needs to be managed and diminished. I'm General Sophia Martinez, and I've been hunting your family's criminal network for 3 years without even knowing it." "General?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "The youngest female general in U.S. military history, the officer who planned and executed Operation Nightingale, the person your father has been protecting and observing while your mother and sister tried to destroy my self-worth." David sank back into his chair, his face pale. "Dad knew? Your father was my oversight officer. He's known exactly who I was from the moment you brought me home." Quote. "Then why didn't he ever say anything?" "Because he was under orders to let me maintain my cover while you and your family revealed your true natures." David buried his face in his hands. "This can't be happening." "It is happening. And tomorrow, federal agents are going to arrest your mother, your uncle, and probably half of your law firm's partners." "What about me?" I looked at him. This man I'd married, this stranger who'd helped diminish me into someone I didn't recognize. "That depends on you." "What do you mean?" "I mean you have a choice. You can cooperate with the investigation, tell the truth about what you've suspected and when you suspected it, and maybe avoid prosecution. Or you can protect your family and go down with them." David looked up at me with eyes that seemed to see me clearly for the first time in 3 years. "Who are you?" "I'm the woman you married and then tried to make disappear. I'm the officer who's been protecting national security while your family's been undermining it." I'm the person who's been shrinking herself to fit into your world, while you've been too cowardward to acknowledge what that world really was. Sophia. General Martinez, I corrected. That's who I am, that's who I've always been, and that's who I'm going to be again. I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the door. Where are you going? David asked. To finish the mission, to clean up the mess your family made, to remember what it feels like to be valued for my competence, instead of apologized for. Will you come back? I paused at the door, looking back at him one last time. I don't know, but I know I won't come back as the woman who's been living here. She's gone. Sophia, wait. General Martinez, I said again. And David, when the agents come tomorrow, tell them the truth, all of it. It's the only chance you have. I left him sitting in the living room of the house that had never been my home, surrounded by the perfect furniture and empty spaces that had defined our marriage. As I drove away, I called Colonel Blackwood. It's done, I told him. I've told David everything. How did he take it? Like a man whose world just exploded, which is exactly what happened. And you? How are you taking it? I thought about that as I drove through the Connecticut darkness toward whatever came next. Like a soldier who just remembered why she joined the fight in the first place. Quote. The next morning, I watched the news from my hotel room as FBI agents led Margaret Blackwood and Richard Blackwood away in handcuffs. The headlines called it the largest investigation into political corruption and money laundering in Connecticut history. David wasn't among those arrested. He'd chosen to cooperate. My phone rang. Agent Sullivan. General Martinez, your transport to Andrews Air Force Base leaves in 2 hours. Are you ready? I looked at myself in the mirror. Hair pulled back in a military bun, uniform pressed and perfect, ribbons and medals in their proper places. For the first time in 3 years, I recognized the woman looking back at me. I'm ready. 6 months later, I stood in the Rose Garden as the President of the United States pinned the Distinguished Service Medal to my uniform. The Eastern European operation had been a complete success, dismantling a network that had threatened national security for over a decade. In the audience, I spotted a familiar figure in dress blues. Colonel James Blackwood stood at attention, his face showing the pride he'd never been allowed to express while I was undercover in his own family. After the ceremony, he approached me. General Martinez, he said formally, then smiled. Or, should I say, my daughter? I smiled back. I think I'd like that. I have something for you, he said, pulling out an envelope. It's from David. I hesitated before taking it. Inside was a single page in David's handwriting. Sophia, General Martinez. I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness, but I want you to know that I finally understand what I lost. Not a wife who needed to be managed, but a woman who deserved to be celebrated. I'm getting help, and I'm trying to become someone worthy of the respect you should have always received. I hope someday you can forgive the man I was and meet the man I'm trying to become. David. I folded the letter carefully and put it away. He's testifying against the remaining network members, Colonel Blackwood said, making amends as much as he can. And you? I'm retiring next month. Margaret is serving 15 years, Richard 20. Caroline is in therapy, but she's going to be fine. He paused. The family name is probably destroyed, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. I looked out over the White House grounds, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. 3 years of humiliation that had led to reclaiming not just my identity, but my purpose. What's next for you? He asked. I've been offered a position at the Pentagon, strategic planning and international operations, the kind of work that matters. And personally, I smiled, thinking about the life I was building, one where I didn't have to apologize for taking up space, where my achievements were celebrated instead of hidden, where I could be fully myself without shame. I'm remembering how to be proud of who I am. Colonel Blackwood James nodded approvingly. That's what I was hoping to hear. As we walked away from the ceremony together, I realized that sometimes the family that tries to destroy you isn't your real family at all. Sometimes your real family is the one that sees your worth even when they can't say so, that protects your future even when they can't protect your present. Sometimes the people who humiliate you are just clearing the way for the people who will honor you. And sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest tactical advantage you can have. They had called me a charity case, a liability, someone who didn't belong. They were wrong about everything except the last part. I didn't belong in their world. I belonged in mine.